I'm Hannah Mitchell, and I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my family's hierarchy, somewhere between disappointment and burden. At 28, I'd spent 4 years scraping by in a moldy studio apartment behind Kim's Fried Chicken, working whatever freelance design gigs I could find while my father reminded me weekly that I was wasting my life. What I didn't know was that $70,000 had my name on it, and the person who'd stolen it was sitting across from me at Sunday brunch. The morning started like any other family gathering at Rosewood Bistro. My grandfather Elliot had insisted on his monthly ritual of bringing everyone together, though everyone had shrunk over the years. Just me, my parents Douglas and Margaret, and my cousin Jamie, who'd driven up from the city in his Tesla, a detail he'd mentioned 3 times already. Grandpa was in one of his generous moods, the kind that made him reminisce about better times and talk about legacy. He'd ordered champagne for the table, though it was barely 10 a.m., and kept patting my hand with his weathered fingers. "You know, sweetheart," he said, raising his glass with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It makes me so happy to see you settled in that apartment I got you. Are you still loving it?" The words hit me like ice water. I set down my fork, the bite of eggs Benedict still in my mouth. "I'm sorry. What apartment?" Grandpa's smile faltered slightly. "The condo, dear. The one downtown. Your father said you were thrilled with it." I felt every pair of eyes at the table turn toward me, but I couldn't look away from my grandfather's confused expression. "Grandpa, I live in a studio behind a fried chicken shop. I've been there for 4 years." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. My father's face had gone completely white, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "That's not possible," Grandpa said slowly. "I gave your father $70,000 4 years ago, specifically to help you get started after college. He said you picked out a beautiful place downtown." My mother's sharp intake of breath was audible. Jamie's mouth had fallen open, but it was my father's expression that told me everything I needed to know. Pure, undiluted panic. "I never received any money," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working 3 jobs just to pay rent on a place that probably violates half the building codes in the city." Grandpa's hand trembled as he set down his champagne glass. "Douglas." His voice had gone cold, the warmth completely drained from it. "Explain this to me." My father finally found his voice, but it came out strangled. "There must be some misunderstanding." "What misunderstanding?" I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. Other diners were starting to stare, but I didn't care. "You told me I was a disappointment. You said I was irresponsible and couldn't handle money. You made me feel like I was nothing but a burden to this family. And the whole time, you had $70,000 that was meant for me?" "Hannah, please, sit down," my mother whispered, her face flushed with embarrassment. "No." I turned to my grandfather, who was staring at my father with an expression I'd never seen before. "Grandpa, I want to show you where I live. I want you to see exactly what your generosity bought me." The drive to my apartment was silent, except for the GPS directions. Grandpa sat in the passenger seat of my 15-year-old Honda, his hands folded carefully in his lap. I could see him taking in the deteriorating neighborhoods as we got closer to my place, his expression growing more troubled with each block. When we pulled up behind Kim's Fried Chicken, the smell of old grease and garbage hit us immediately. The building was a converted house from the 1940s, painted a sickly yellow that had faded to the color of old mustard. My apartment was accessed through a narrow alley that always smelled like urine and rotting food. "This is it," I said, unlocking the door to my studio. "Home sweet home." Grandpa stepped inside and I watched his face carefully. The apartment was maybe 300 square feet, with a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a sink that only worked if you hit it in the right spot. The bathroom was so small you had to close the door to use the toilet, and the shower was a handheld attachment that sprayed water in every direction except where you wanted it. But it was the walls that really told the story. They were covered in a persistent black mold that I'd given up trying to scrub away. The single window faced the brick wall of the building next door, letting in no natural light. The floor was covered in linoleum that had probably been installed in the 1970s, curling up at the edges and stained with things I preferred not to think about. "Jesus Christ," Grandpa whispered, running his hand along the wall. His fingers came away black with mold. "How long have you been living here?" 4 years, I said. "Since I graduated. Dad said I needed to learn to stand on my own 2 feet, that handouts would make me soft. He said you agreed with him." Grandpa sat down heavily on my futon, which doubled as my bed and my couch. The springs groaned under his weight. "He told me you were proud, that you didn't want help. He said you'd gotten angry when he offered to help you find a place, that you wanted to prove you could make it on your own." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I begged him to help me find something better. I showed him pictures of this place, told him about the mold, the leak in the ceiling that drips onto my bed when it rains. He said it would build character. My grandfather's face was turning red, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "I need to make some phone calls," he said quietly. "Can you drive me to the bank?" The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Grandpa had kept meticulous records of every financial transaction, and it didn't take long to piece together exactly what had happened. The bank records showed a clear paper trail: $70,000 transferred from Elliot Mitchell's account to Douglas Mitchell's account on June 15, 2020, with a memo that read, "Hannah's Apartment Fund." But there were more records. Just 5 days later, the entire amount had been transferred to a high-yield investment account under my father's name alone. No mention of me, no indication that the money was meant for anyone else. "He's been collecting interest on your money for 4 years, the banker explained, sliding the documents across the desk. "It's grown to almost 90,000 now." Grandpa's hands were shaking as he reviewed the papers. "I want to understand this correctly," he said, his voice deadly calm. "My son took money that was specifically designated for his daughter, lied to both of us about it, and has been profiting from it while she lived in squalor." "That appears to be correct, Mr. Mitchell." I felt numb. All those years of feeling like a failure, of wondering why I couldn't seem to get ahead no matter how hard I worked. All those nights lying awake in my moldy apartment, listening to the rats in the walls and wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't even afford basic housing. "What can we do about it?" I asked. The banker looked uncomfortable. "Well, technically, the money was transferred to Mr. Douglas Mitchell legally. However, if there was fraud involved, or if he was acting as a trustee—" "He was acting as a trustee," Grandpa said firmly. "The money was for Hannah, not for him. I have documents." By the time we left the bank, Grandpa had initiated several actions. He'd frozen the investment account, started paperwork to transfer the money to an account in my name, and most importantly, he'd scheduled a meeting with a lawyer for the next day. "I want you to understand something," he said as we sat in the parking lot. "Your father is going to try to explain this away. He's going to have excuses, probably involving protecting you or teaching you lessons. Don't let him." "I won't," I said. But my voice sounded hollow even to me. "Hannah." He turned to face me fully. "I failed you. I should have checked on you myself instead of trusting his word. I should have known something was wrong when you never called to thank me. I didn't know there was anything to thank you for. I know that now, and I'm going to make this right." That evening, I sat in my apartment and tried to process what had happened. My phone had been ringing all day. My father, my mother, even Jamie. I'd ignored all of them. I needed time to think, to figure out how I felt about this betrayal that was somehow both shocking and completely predictable. My father had always been critical of me, but I'd assumed it came from a place of wanting me to succeed. Now I realized it had been something much darker, a systematic effort to keep me down, to make me feel small and incapable. Every time I'd started to gain confidence, he'd been there to knock me back down. I thought about all the times I'd asked for help over the years. When I'd been sick with pneumonia and couldn't afford the doctor visit. When my car had broken down and I'd had to walk to work for 2 weeks. When I'd been so behind on rent that I'd considered sleeping in my car. Each time, he'd lectured me about responsibility and self-reliance. Meanwhile, he'd been sitting on enough money to change my life completely. The next morning, I met Grandpa at his lawyer's office. Robert Steinberg was a sharp-eyed man in his 60s who'd been handling my grandfather's affairs for decades. He reviewed the documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen every type of family drama imaginable. "This is fairly straightforward," he said. "Your father accepted funds in trust for your benefit and then converted them to his own use. That's embezzlement, and it's fraud. We can pursue both civil and criminal charges." "I don't want to destroy him," I said quietly. "You don't have to," Grandpa replied. "But you do need to get your money back, and you need to make sure he understands the consequences of his actions." Mr. Steinberg leaned back in his chair. "I suggest we start with a demand letter, full restitution, plus interest, plus damages for the housing costs you've incurred over the past 4 years. If he cooperates, we can keep this out of court." "And if he doesn't?" I asked. "Then we file charges and let the district attorney handle it." The demand letter was delivered that afternoon by certified mail. It laid out the facts in stark, legal language. Douglas Mitchell had received $70,000 in trust for his daughter Hannah Mitchell, had instead converted the funds to his own use, and was now required to make full restitution within 30 days. The response came faster than I expected. My father called me at 6 p.m., his voice shaking with rage. "How dare you," he said without preamble. "How dare you involve lawyers and make this into some sort of scandal? I'm your father." "Are you?" I asked. "Because fathers don't usually steal from their children." "I didn't steal anything. I invested it. It's grown significantly." "It's grown because you've been earning interest on money that wasn't yours," I interrupted. "While I've been living in a slum, you've been profiting from my inheritance." "Inheritance?" He laughed bitterly. "You think you're entitled to handouts? You think money should just be given to you?" "I think money that was specifically designated for me should have been given to me. Yes." "You would have wasted it. You were completely irresponsible." "I was 24 years old and trying to start my life. You made sure I couldn't." The silence stretched between us. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more desperate. "Hannah, please. We can work this out as a family. You don't need lawyers." "We tried working it out as a family," I said. "That's how I ended up living in a moldy studio for 4 years while you collected interest on my money." "I was trying to teach you." "You weren't trying to teach me anything. You were trying to control me. You wanted me to feel grateful for scraps while you hoarded what was rightfully mine." I hung up before he could respond. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering. My father hired his own lawyer, who attempted to argue that the money had been a gift to Douglas, not a trust for me. Grandpa's records, however, were thorough and damning. Every document, every email, every conversation had been about helping me get started in life. More importantly, Mr. Steinberg had discovered something interesting in the investment account records. My father had been making regular withdrawals over the past 4 years, not huge amounts, but enough to suggest he'd been treating the money as his personal slush fund. "He's used almost $15,000 of it," Mr. Steinberg reported. "Vacation to Hawaii, new car down payment, home improvements, all while his daughter was living in substandard housing." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. It was one thing to discover that money meant for me had been invested without my knowledge. It was another to learn that my father had been using it to fund luxuries while I'd been choosing between groceries and rent. On Thursday, exactly 1 week after the confrontation at brunch, Grandpa called me. "I want to have dinner with your parents tonight," he said. "I want you there." "I don't think that's a good idea." "I didn't ask what you thought. I asked you to be there." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument. "Okay. Where?" "Their house, 7 o'clock. This ends tonight." When I arrived at my parents' house, I could see my father pacing in the living room through the front window. My mother answered the door, her face drawn and tired. "Hannah," she said quietly, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "I know." "Mom." Grandpa's car pulled up as I was walking to the door. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who'd made peace with what he was about to do. The living room felt smaller than I remembered, cramped with too much furniture and too many secrets. My father stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. "Sit down, Douglas," Grandpa said. "Dad, I can explain." I said sit down. The command in his voice was unmistakable. My father sat. Grandpa placed a folder on the coffee table. "I've spent the past week reviewing 4 years of financial records. Bank statements, investment accounts, withdrawal records. Do you know what I found?" My father's jaw tightened. "Whatever you think you found." "I found evidence of systematic theft from my granddaughter. I found evidence that you've been lying to me for 4 years. I found evidence that you've been using money intended for Hannah to fund your own lifestyle. I was protecting it. I was growing it for her. You were stealing it." Grandpa's voice was calm, matter of fact. "You took money that was meant to give your daughter a start in life, and you used it for yourself while she lived in conditions that most people wouldn't keep their pets in." My mother was crying quietly in the corner. I'd never seen her look so small. "I've prepared a settlement agreement," Grandpa continued. "You're going to sign it tonight. You're going to transfer the full amount of the investment account to Hannah immediately. You're going to reimburse her for 4 years of rent payments on that apartment, and you're going to do it without any further legal challenges." "And if I don't?" my father asked. "Then I file criminal charges tomorrow morning. Embezzlement, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Mr. Steinberg assures me that with the evidence we have, you'll be looking at significant jail time." The room fell silent except for the sound of my mother's quiet sobs. My father stared at the settlement agreement, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. "You don't understand," he said finally. "She would have wasted it. She was so naive, so unprepared for the real world. I was trying to protect her. By lying to her? By letting her live in squalor? By making her feel like a failure? By teaching her to be strong, by making her self-reliant." "You didn't make her self-reliant," I said quietly. "You made her desperate. There's a difference." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear? Maybe. Or recognition. I thought. He started, then stopped. "I thought if you had it too easy, you'd never learn to fight for yourself." "I've been fighting for myself for 4 years," I said. "I've been fighting for basic dignity, for enough money to eat, for a place to live that wouldn't make me sick. I've been fighting battles you made necessary by stealing from me." "I didn't steal." "Yes, you did." The words came out harder than I'd intended. "You stole my money, you stole my trust, and you stole 4 years of my life. You made me believe I was failing when the truth was that you were sabotaging me." My father looked at the settlement agreement again. His hands were shaking. "If I sign this, what happens to us?" he asked. "What happens to this family?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can forgive this. Hannah, you sat across from me at dinner parties and lectured me about responsibility. You made me feel like I was worthless, like I couldn't do anything right. You watched me struggle and suffer, and you never once showed me any compassion. Because you knew I should have been doing better, and you were the reason I wasn't. I was trying to help you." "No." I stood up, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "You were trying to control me. You were trying to make me dependent on your approval, on your version of love. You wanted me to be grateful for scraps so you could feel like the generous father, doling out affection when I earned it. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time you said you were proud of me? When was the last time you acknowledged that I was working hard, that I was trying to build something? You couldn't, because if you admitted I was doing well despite your sabotage, you'd have to admit what you'd done." My father's face crumpled. For a moment, he looked like a stranger, smaller, older, more fragile than I'd ever seen him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know you are. But sorry doesn't give me back 4 years of my life." He signed the settlement agreement with shaking hands. The sound of his pen on paper was the loudest thing in the room. The money was transferred the next morning. $93,000, plus reimbursement for rent and moving expenses. More money than I'd ever seen in one place, more than I'd ever imagined having. But the strangest part was how little it changed immediately. I still woke up in the same moldy apartment, still had the same freelance deadlines, still felt the same fundamental uncertainty about my future. The difference was possibility. For the first time in 4 years, I could make choices based on what I wanted instead of what I could afford. I could think about the future instead of just surviving the present. I spent the first week just sitting with it, trying to process what had happened. Grandpa called every day, checking on me, making sure I was okay. He'd also made it clear that my father was no longer welcome at family gatherings, at least not while I was there. "I won't make you choose," he told me, "but I won't pretend this didn't happen either." The apartment search took 3 days. I'd forgotten what it was like to have options, to be able to say no to places that weren't good enough. I found a one-bedroom in a converted Victorian house about 20 minutes from downtown. It had hardwood floors, 2 large windows that actually opened, and a kitchen where I could stand upright. But more than that, it had light, real, natural light that streamed in during the morning and made everything look possible. Moving day was surreal. I'd accumulated so little over the 4 years that everything fit in Grandpa's truck in one trip. As we loaded the last box, I looked back at the studio apartment that had been my prison for so long. "Any regrets?" Grandpa asked. "Just one," I said. "I regret that it took so long to learn the truth." The new apartment felt enormous after the studio. I kept expecting to bump into walls that weren't there, to run out of space that kept expanding. The first night, I couldn't sleep because it was too quiet. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing, no rats scratching in the walls. But I wasn't done yet. Having a decent place to live was just the beginning. I'd been out of the interior design field for 4 years, working odd jobs and freelance graphics just to pay rent. But I'd kept my portfolio updated, kept learning new software, kept dreaming about the kind of work I really wanted to do. The next week, I started applying to design firms. Real jobs, not just freelance work, jobs that would use my education, my skills, my ideas. The response was better than I'd hoped. My portfolio was strong, and I'd developed a practical sensibility during my years of making do with nothing. I understood budgets, timelines, the difference between what clients wanted and what they could afford. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 interviews. Within a month, I had a job offer from a small firm that specialized in affordable housing projects. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd be designing living spaces for people who couldn't afford much, using everything I'd learned about making small spaces work. My first project was a renovation of a low-income apartment complex. The units were similar to my old studio in size, but I was determined to make them feel like homes instead of cells. I spent hours researching space-saving solutions, light-maximizing techniques, ways to create privacy and comfort in tight quarters. The project manager was impressed. "You have a real understanding of what people need," she said. "Most designers who haven't lived in these conditions don't get it." "I get it," I said. 6 months after the confrontation at brunch, I was a different person. Not just because of the money, though that had made everything possible. I was different because I finally understood my own worth, separate from my father's approval or disapproval. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to believe in my capabilities. I'd learned that the voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough wasn't my voice at all. It was his. I hadn't spoken to my father since the night he signed the settlement agreement. My mother called sometimes, carefully neutral conversations that avoided any mention of what had happened. I think she was hoping we'd all eventually pretend it never occurred. But I couldn't pretend. What had happened was too fundamental, too revealing of who my father really was. He'd shown me that his love was conditional on my dependence, that he was willing to sabotage my success to maintain his control. That wasn't love. I was still learning what love actually looked like. Grandpa showed me, in his quiet way. He'd visit my new apartment, admire the changes I'd made, listen to stories about my work. He never said I told you so, or made me feel like I owed him anything. He just loved me, unconditionally. The way I'd always thought parents were supposed to love their children. "You're blooming," he told me one Sunday afternoon as we sat on my small balcony, drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood kids play in the street below. "I'm trying," I said. "You're succeeding. Your father was wrong about you. Hannah, you were never the problem." It was a year before I saw my father again. I was at the grocery store, loading my cart with actual groceries instead of the cheapest possible options, when I spotted him in the produce section. He looked older, grayer, more stooped than I remembered. Our eyes met across the display of apples. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he approached slowly, cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal. "Hannah," he said quietly, "you look well." "Thank you." "I've been thinking about what you said, about trust, about control. I think you might have been right." I didn't answer immediately. I was studying his face, looking for signs of manipulation, of the smooth explanations that had kept me confused for so long. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I'm getting there," I said. "Good. That's good." We stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the mundane bustle of grocery shopping. Other customers pushed past us, focused on their own errands, their own lives. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally. "I don't know if it can be fixed," I replied. "But I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. Done. Done letting you define my worth. Done waiting for your approval. Done believing that your version of love is the only version that matters." He nodded slowly, and I saw something in his expression that might have been respect. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I should have said that years ago." "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." That was the last time we spoke. He died 2 years later, suddenly, of a heart attack. I went to the funeral, sat in the back, listened to people talk about what a good man he'd been. I didn't speak at the service, didn't share memories or stories about our relationship, but I didn't feel guilty about that. I'd learned that forgiveness doesn't require pretending the past was different than it was. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is acknowledge that someone you loved was also someone who hurt you, and that both things can be true at the same time. I kept working, kept growing, kept building the life I wanted instead of the life I'd been told I deserved. I bought a house eventually, small but mine, with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. I started dating carefully, learning to trust my judgment about people's character. And every Sunday, I had brunch with Grandpa, not at restaurants, but in my kitchen, with windows open and light streaming in. We'd sit at my table, eating eggs Benedict that I'd learned to make properly, and he'd tell me stories about his own life, his mistakes and victories and regrets. "You know what I'm proudest of?" he asked one morning, cutting into his eggs. "What?" "Not that I gave you the money. Anyone could have done that. I'm proud that you knew what to do with it. I'm proud that you didn't let what happened to you make you bitter or small." "It did make me bitter," I admitted. "For a while. But you didn't stay bitter. That's the difference." I looked around my kitchen, at the flowers on the counter, at the cookbook I'd left open to a recipe I wanted to try, at the life I'd built for myself, piece by piece, decision by decision. "I think I'm happy," I said. "I think this is what happy feels like." "Good," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "That's all I ever wanted for you." The morning sun slanted through the windows, casting everything in warm, golden light. Outside, I could hear the neighbors talking, children playing, the ordinary sounds of a life being lived. I'd learned that revenge isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's about refusing to stay broken. Sometimes, it's about building something beautiful from the pieces of what was taken from you. Sometimes, it's about sitting in your own kitchen, in your own house, eating food you can afford, surrounded by light, and realizing that the person who tried to keep you small was wrong about everything that mattered. And sometimes that's enough.